Good morning, everyone. I hope your day is starting off as fantastic as it possibly can. Pipelines, pipelines, pipelines. And one of the main topics of discussion in the election campaign was, will the Liberals, led by our new Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, be able to facilitate the construction of more pipelines so we can get our oil and gas to other markets other than the United States? Now, unfortunately, what you hear politicians say, or what you don't hear politicians say, is not the best source of information when you're trying to understand a very complicated topic. And right now, the main source of information that Canadians have to rely on to try and understand this issue is what politicians are saying. And generally speaking, this is what they're saying. The Conservatives, Daniel Smith and Pierre Poilievre, are saying things like, we can't get any pipelines built. It's all the Liberals' fault. They've been in power for 10 years and they won't allow us to build pipelines. They're anti-pipelines. We can't get any pipelines built. Pierre Poilievre goes on to say that the Liberals have introduced an anti-pipeline, a no more pipeline law. Now, what are the Liberals saying? Not much. Why are the Liberals not saying much? Because as you know, as we all know, the Liberals were responsible for building the latest major pipeline in Canada, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, a pipeline that connects Alberta oil from Edmonton to Tidewater at Vancouver and is now being used to export oil to markets other than the United States, up to 1 million barrels a day. Why don't the Liberals push back on the Conservatives and say, hey, wait a minute, we're the guys that are responsible for building one of the major pipeline projects in the country? Well, both sides are doing what is politically popular. It's very popular for conservative politicians, especially in the West, to scream about pipelines and blame the Liberals that we can't build any. And it's not very popular for Liberals to talk about pipelines because the Liberals rely on votes in central Canada, in Ontario and Quebec. The Liberals are willing to take the hit politically from the Conservatives and not be the champions of pipelines, even though they built one, because them talking up and taking credit for the construction of pipelines and being pro-pipeline would actually hurt them in their stronghold. So with these politicians posturing and spewing their rhetoric, how do we as Canadians actually even know what's going on? Well, in this video, I'm going to try and present some facts impartially, because don't we all just want to hear some facts and some actual analysis rather than just tuning into our favorite comfortable echo chamber? Let's get into it. Brian Mulroney was the first prime minister that negotiated the first major free trade deal with the United States. He was a conservative prime minister. Now, that deal is viewed as a major accomplishment between Canada and the US, and it helped launch the integration of the trade relationship between the two countries. Now, something that was included in that initial trade deal and was passed on to NAFTA, which was the next upgrade of that deal, was something called the proportionality clause, which required Canada to maintain a fixed proportion of its energy exports to the United States, even if Canada faced shortages. This meant Canada could not reduce U.S. access to energy resources like oil and natural gas unless there was a corresponding reduction in Canada's own access. Why was this clause included in the deal? Well, the Americans feared that if they started allowing Canadian energy to be exported into the United States and they grew dependent on that energy and they started importing more and more and more of it, they did not want to run into the situation where Canada could just stop. And in those days, the fear was actually that we might run out of oil and that Canada would need that oil for itself. No one was thinking of this scenario. What if oil production increases rapidly? And it did, because of new technology that didn't exist at the time, like fracking, which enabled us to develop a lot of unconventional reserves. No one foresaw the possibility that oil production would increase rapidly and that Canada might have excess oil that it could export to other countries overseas. In those days, we were living in a landlocked world in Canada where we believed that our only export market would be the United States, and we were happy to put this clause in the deal. We were willing to give in to the United States' concerns at the time, national security concerns. They viewed energy and oil in particular as a strategic asset. They have a strategic reserve. We were willing to give in to those concerns to obtain access to a large market. And at the time, it was viewed as a very good deal and a worthwhile concession. Many people were concerned about this clause. And let me bring you to an article from 2008 from the Parkland Institute, which is an Alberta-based research organization which publishes a lot of articles about oil and gas and development of oil and gas. And they wrote this article while NAFTA was in place, while this clause was still in place, They wrote, proportionality is an obscure sounding clause which requires Canada to maintain its current share of energy exports to the United States, even if Canadians experience shortages. It effectively guarantees the U.S. access to Canada's energy resources in perpetuity, or until NAFTA and the FTA are renegotiated or ended, or the resources run out. This clause is unique in all the world's treaties. Even Canada's fellow NAFTA partner and major oil exporter Mexico is exempt. You can even Google modern summaries of what this clause meant. The NAFTA proportionality clause, specifically concerning oil and natural gas, obligated Canada to maintain a specific proportion of its energy exports to the United States, regardless of domestic needs or priorities. And I'll skip to the last sentence here, which is the key. This clause could hinder Canada's ability to conserve oil, prioritize natural gas for petrochemicals, or develop an energy security plan. An energy security plan which might involve building pipelines to export oil to other countries other than the United States. Now, this clause was included and effective in our first free trade deal that was negotiated by Brian Mulroney, our conservative prime minister. It remained in NAFTA and was only removed when Donald Trump negotiated the greatest deal ever negotiated on earth, and Canada successfully convinced the Americans to drop this clause, a clause which effectively gave the Americans total control of how Canadian oil and gas distribution would be developed. And behind me is a picture of the three leaders that were in power at the time signing the new USMCA or CUSMA agreement that eliminated that clause, which was a huge win for Canada. Nice negotiating there, Donald. So after this proportionality clause was removed in the USMCA, which major pipeline projects did Canadian industry pursue? Well, there were three major pipeline projects. One of them, the Keystone XL pipeline, would have brought Alberta oil into the United States. Even though this clause was removed, the United States was still a huge consumer of oil and gas. This would have been a major pipeline that would have increased exports of oil to the United States. Now, that pipeline project was not blocked by the Liberals. It was not blocked by a no pipeline law. That pipeline was approved and being constructed. As it was being built, one of the first things that newly elected President Joe Biden did was cancel the pipeline. He revoked approval of the pipeline. And this infuriated Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta at the time, calling it a betrayal and a stab in the back. And it was. The pipeline was approved by all levels of government and was proceeding. And it was Joe Biden that killed that pipeline. Another major pipeline project that has proceeded since that clause was removed is this red one here on the map on the left here on the screen that connects Edmonton with Vancouver. Now, there was an existing pipeline there called the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and there has since been built a Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion that is capable of taking about 1 million barrels from Alberta to Vancouver that can be put on tanker ships and sold anywhere in the world. Now, that pipeline was originally planned and approved and was under the process of going through engineering studies and beginning of construction by Kinder Morgan. And as many of you know, this is the pipeline that eventually the Liberal government purchased. They purchased the project from Kinder Morgan and managed the construction of this project. And now this pipeline is owned by the federal government and is now making revenue from the transportation fees that they charge producers to use the pipeline. Now, a lot of people don't even understand how pipelines get built, okay? Oil companies don't build pipelines. Let me explain it. It's important to understand this. It might make the video longer, but let me explain this. Pipeline companies build pipelines. And the way they do that, if it's a major pipeline, small pipelines are easier to build, and they're usually built to connect production to facilities. And that's easy. But when you're going to build a major arterial pipeline that may cost tens or fives of billions of dollars, a pipeline company needs, before it invests that money, to have the assurance that they can fill that pipeline. Because a private pipeline company risks the capital to build the pipeline in the first place. Now, the pipeline company over time will recoup its initial investment and earn an acceptable rate of return by charging a transportation fee on the product that goes through its pipeline. That transportation fee is usually paid by the producers, the sellers of the product. Sometimes they negotiate with the purchasers. Once a pipeline is built and operational, it generates quite a bit of income. And these companies that build pipelines are known as utility type companies. And incidentally, the pipeline that the Liberal government built, the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, it's not simply an expenditure. Right now, that is an asset that owned by the federal government that's going to generate income for decades. So why would a pipeline company risk $10-20 billion to build a major pipeline project like connecting Alberta to New Brunswick? Why would they spend that money? Well, they have to have assurance before they invest the money that that pipeline can be filled with product so that they can charge the fees. And a major pipeline like that may carry 1 or 2 million barrels a day. And the only way they can have assurance of having that product, they're not going to displace product from other pipelines, right? There's already oil traveling around in the pipeline system that we have now. The only way a project like this will proceed is if there's a major escalation in production in Alberta. And the only way there'll be a major escalation in production in Alberta, it's not going to happen by drilling a few conventional oil wells. In Alberta, to get that kind of production increase is going to require an expansion of the oil sands, a new 1 million or 2 million barrel a day expansion in oil sands production. And for an oil company to do that, they need assurance that they're going to get their return, and they have to have an expectation that oil prices will be at a level where that will be profitable. And also an expectation that there will be a pipeline ready when their new production comes online. And the key player that will have to coordinate the whole thing will have to be the federal government, because they're in charge of the whole approval process. And they will have to step in as kind of the entity that de-risks the project and gives the confidence to both the oil companies and the pipeline companies that this will proceed. And it may be that the federal government will have to pay for the pipeline or in some way be involved with funding it, maybe in a partnership or in some sort of an arrangement. This is very complicated, but I assure you a project of this magnitude will not just proceed just because someone says, oh yeah, we should build a pipeline. This whole thing is very complicated, and it's going to need a coordinated effort between industry and government. And just to put it in perspective, the Trans Mountain expansion that was just completed recently, connecting Edmonton to Vancouver basically, was so expensive. It cost $38 billion. And I know there'll be some conservatives that are watching this video go, well, the only reason it costs that much is because of environmental approvals and all the BS that the Liberals introduced. And it was a real mistake for the Liberals to buy that pipeline. And the private sector could have done it a lot cheaper. And of course, that's a fairy tale. And the reason that Kinder Morgan stopped pursuing to build that project was, number one, was because it was becoming apparent that they may not get approval, mainly because of the opposition of the British Columbia government. The then Premier Horgan was dead set against having the pipeline go forward. And also, they started getting cost estimates, and they realized that this thing was going to cost a lot more than the $4 to $7 billion that they were planning on. How could it be that expensive? Does that make sense? Well, let me show you why. Here we are on Google Maps hovering over the city of Edmonton. Let's go from Edmonton to Winnipeg. Okay, guys? Let's see what the map looks like if you go from Edmonton to Winnipeg. Oh, look at that. If you want to go from Edmonton to Winnipeg, it's a 13-hour drive. And if you want to build a pipeline between Edmonton and Winnipeg, I bet it would only cost about $2 billion. Why? Have you ever driven this? This is flat-ass prairie. All you need is a really big backhoe that drives along and scoops the earth, flips the earth open, put the pipeline in, close it back up. This would be one of the easiest pipelines to build in the world. What happens if you want to go from Edmonton to Vancouver? Whoa, that's about the same distance. It's a 12-and-a-half-hour drive. But guys, this pipeline crosses the largest mountain range in the world, okay? If you zoom in here and see what this pipeline had to cross, the Rocky Mountains, It had to cross and wind its way and burrow its way through, not soil that you could flip over with a backhoe, burrow through mountains. It had to cross major river valleys that flood when all the snow from these mountains that you see in this picture melts and rushes down these valleys, huge torrents, 100 feet deep. Somehow that pipeline had to get burrowed underneath in solid rock where it would be safe. This was a world-class engineering marvel, and the reason it cost $38 billion has nothing to do with liberals or conservatives. It has to do with this thing was really hard to build. And if you're an engineer and you're looking at this, you're probably going, yeah, that looks like it would be a tough one. The pipeline is currently in use now and is responsible for some major shifts in Canada's export destinations for oil. For example, if we look at this graph provided by Bloomberg, this graph shows the pivot that China is making right now. And on the graph, the blue number represents Chinese imports of US oil, and the white line represents Chinese imports of Canadian oil. And you can see that since 2016, there's been virtually zero exports of Canadian oil to China. A couple of little blips there, but from 2022 to 2024, zero exports of Canadian oil to China. But since the Trans Mountain Pipeline has been completed by the end of 2024 here, you can see that immediately China is starting to buy Canadian oil, and the white line is going up and the blue line is going down. And this development could have been viewed as a violation of that proportionality clause in our original free trade deal with the United States and NAFTA. So it's because we negotiated and removed that clause from the USMCA that Canada could proceed and diversify markets and not worry about violating that clause. Now, we Canadians, when we sign a deal, we stick to the rules of that deal, unlike the United States, which signs deals and then really just does whatever it wants in the future. Now, behind me on the screen is the third major pipeline project that has proceeded in Canada since we've eliminated that clause in the USMCA. And I got this from the Coastal GasLink website, where they are updating the progress. And this project links natural gas infrastructure that exists in Alberta and BC. I think it connects it here close to Dawson Creek. That's where the pipeline starts. And it crosses the Rocky Mountains here and ends at Kitimat, where a major LNG terminal has been built, liquefied natural gas. This gas will travel to Kitimat. It will be cooled to very low temperatures and turned into a liquid, and LNG transport vessels will pick it up and navigate through this fjord out into the Pacific Ocean and take this natural gas to world markets. The Kamat LNG project, also known as LNG Canada, is on track to begin shipping its first LNG cargoes in the middle of 2025. So look for, in the middle of 2025, a big spike in Canada's exports. For the first time ever, Canada will be exporting natural gas. Up until now, all our natural gas production has been put into pipelines and transported throughout the North American pipeline system. Now, I should point out that that proportionality clause in our original free trade deal with the United States and NAFTA, the original deal, remember, negotiated by Brian Mulroney, a conservative, would have made a project like this difficult to even get off the ground. Canada could have tried to do it, but the Americans would have certainly objected using that clause and used all their power to try and stop any of our energy expansion projects, keeping our resources for themselves. Now, I think the next major project that Canada will consider, and it will probably be in the news over the next 2, 3, 4 years. And when I say in the news, what that means is you'll hear a lot of politicians mudslinging at each other and shouting slogans back and forth. There'll be very little information for Canadians to actually try and figure out what's going on. But let me show you on a map here. And this is a map of all the major pipeline routes in North America. And you can see that from a Canadian perspective, all the pipelines that originate in Alberta, in Edmonton, there's only one that goes to the ocean, the Trans Mountain and Trans Mountain Expansion, so I guess 2. And all other pipelines that originate in Alberta work their way and eventually cross into the United States. They work their way through the United States, and then there's 2 major connections to Sarnia, where they cross back into Canada. And from Sarnia, you see this gray line potential connection to Montreal. And this is why one of the strange things about Canada is that we're a net exporter of oil. We have much more oil than we can consume ourselves. But Eastern Canada, in particular Ontario and Quebec, where most of the people live in Canada, rely on importing oil. So a nation-building connection project, the logical thing to do for Canada would be to build a major east-west connection, starting at Edmonton and probably following this route and some way working its way through Ontario and into Quebec and possibly all the way to St. John's. Now that's a major, major, major project, and it was proposed in the past, and it received stiff opposition, mainly from Quebec and Ontario. And that project never got off the ground. Now, whether this project proceeds now is a very complicated question, and there's a lot of factors. It's a huge project. It would be one of the longest pipelines built in the world. It would need approval and buy-in from the majority of Canada. And the most important thing is it would need an increase in supply of oil from Alberta, new oil production, to fill the new export capacity that this pipeline would provide. And in order to get that increased production, you don't just snap your finger and get an extra 1 million or 2 million barrels a day. And there's no private pipeline company that will just invest the capital to build the line without being assured that it will be filled with product. I don't think producers would consider the option of switching production through this current system that goes into the United States and switching it into this new pipeline to export into overseas markets. That would just be a very complicated thing to do with contracts that are already in place. Not to mention how that would affect the relationship between the United States and Canada. I can't even imagine how that would play out. So in order for a major project like this to go forward, Alberta would have to increase its production significantly. The oil sands are really the type of production that gives you that guaranteed production profile over a long period of time, because the oil sands are basically a mining operation. You can think of it almost as the reserves are infinite, and you can increase production just by spending more capital and mining more. So this will be a very complicated project to move forward, if it moves forward at all. And potentially it may need a de-risking of all parties with the infusion of some capital from, say, levels of government, perhaps the federal government or a consortium of provincial governments that are willing to partner with private companies and maybe own a piece of the project or pay for it themselves and own it as an asset and start making money on the transportation fees. There's many, many different ways that this could go. And is there a political will to do it across the nation? I would say that the political will is orders of magnitude higher today than it has been in the past. So we'll see if it proceeds. So I hope this little information video helped you understand how some of the politics behind the scenes has affected some of the major projects that were contemplated or that were finally built in Canada. And one of the key things I want to stress again, one of the key reasons that Canada is in the position that we are now with most of our energy exports going to the United States is not the fault of a couple of policies that a government has made in the last couple of years. It is a long history that started with our first trade deal with the United States, where we basically precluded ourselves from selling energy to anyone but the United States. And that clause was maintained in the NAFTA agreement, and we basically had no ability to diversify our markets or really any desire to, because the US was capable of purchasing all our energy anyway, and we were happy to just sell it to them. And we had no idea that down the road we would have a hostile president that would start a trade war with us, that would make us wish that we had diversified. But ironically, the president that has now started the trade war with Canada is the very one that signed the USMCA, which eliminated that clause. So thanks again, Donald. Now, there's a lot of other factors and a lot of other politics that happened, of course, in the past 20, 25 years. And you can't cover everything in a video. What I just wanted to cover in this video is that there was a real reason that Canada's energy development proceeded in the way it did, and it was the law. It was governed by law, the law of the free trade agreement that we signed with the United States, and NAFTA, which represented the law governing our trade with the United States, and it happened to govern how we developed our energy infrastructure. Now, I also wanted to point out that despite the winding path that our resource infrastructure has taken in this country, affected by trade deals and affected by politics, here is a graph of total oil production from Alberta. And this is from the Alberta government website itself. And their data goes back to 2008. And you can see that Alberta oil production has been steadily increasing and is right now pretty much at the highest it's ever been in history. And Canadian exports of oil and gas represents the largest portion by value of Canadian exports as a whole. So why so angry all the time, Danielle? Making videos like this requires a lot of research and takes me a lot of time. So if you guys want to show appreciation, the best and simplest way to do it is just to subscribe to the channel and share the video so maybe more people can watch. And if you want to support my work monetarily, you could always consider becoming a channel member. I always post as the first pinned comment in the comment section a link where you can do that. And if you do become a channel member and leave comments in the comment section, I always reply to my channel members. Thanks for watching, guys. I will catch you on the next one.